Please welcome David Wallace-Wells, opinion writer and columnist for the New York Times Magazine, who will read an adaptation of What?
Remember Paris? I'm here to tell a story about climate politics and geopolitics and how they've changed over the last decade. Maybe degraded is the better word. It's going to be a bit of a departure from the rest of the programming of the day, and that story begins 10 years ago, just outside the French capital, where the entire world gathered together and hammered out a plan to avoid disastrous climate change. The Guardian called the Paris Agreement the world's greatest diplomatic success. Barack Obama said that it was the best chance we had to save the one planet we've got. And he was far from alone. There were skeptics who thought the temperature goals of the agreement were maybe too ambitious, that we couldn't get there. There was another kind of skeptic who thought the whole project of decarbonization was a kind of foolish boondoggle. But overwhelmingly, the global response was elation. And why wouldn't it be? The UN conferences had been warning about warming for decades, but efforts to actually do something to prevent climate change hadn't really come to much. This time, it seemed, would be different. And it wasn't just a matter of climate. If you squinted at least, the world seemed poised on the threshold of an entirely new era. The UN had just declared victory, a kind of spectacular victory, in its Millennium Development Goals, which had cut extreme poverty worldwide by something like 70% in 15 years. And they'd announced a new set of even more ambitious goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, which aimed to eliminate extreme poverty entirely, along with a whole lot of other really ambitious agenda items. The war on terror, which had kind of deranged American foreign policy for about a decade, seemed by 2015 a lot less pressing. Obama had won the Nobel Peace Prize sort of just for coming into office. And he seemed to many people in the global elite like just the kind of cool-headed, post-ideological, technocratic liberal who should be in charge. People talked about the possibility of a G2 future, a world co-shepherded by the US and China acting mostly as partners, not as rivals. Paris showed us what that might look like, what kind of future it might point to. The agreement wasn't meant to be a one-shot solution. Other steps, it was assumed, would follow towards faster climate action, yes, but also towards greater global cooperation, mutual obligation, solidarity, in part because of what climate action implied, and in part because of what a growing sense of climate justice seemed to demand. That was all 10 years ago. And now, we are living in a very different world. Paris doesn't look like the future anymore. It looks a lot more like the past, like the last gasp of an end-of-history fantasy, a kind of 1990s liberal internationalism, imported into the 2010s and set to crash upon the rocks of history. Those Sustainable Development Goals, most have registered no progress over the last 10 years. We've gone from the G2 to a new Cold War. And on climate, well, we haven't saved the planet. Paris helped mobilize an awful lot of green energy, and we'd surely be in a worse place without it. But the more ambitious 1.5-degree target established in Paris is now functionally out of reach. The 2-degree target is getting pretty close. These are warming levels which not that long ago, frankly, terrified us. Now we are accommodating ourselves to them, defining our failure to meet those thresholds as a kind of success because we have nothing else to do. We're steering clear of some of the worst climate futures that we used to imagine, but we're racing past the things we told ourselves we could not accept. Right after Paris, climate was an inspiring global cause. Millions marched in the streets. There were quantum leaps in policy. Every major leader the world over showed up at climate conferences speaking in existential terms about the risks of warming. And when they were talking about what must be done, doing so in terms of a full-scale mobilization, a World War II scale mobilization, was a phrase that was used a lot in those days. Now when you go to those climate conferences, most of those leaders are missing. There's still plenty of work to do at COP, as you heard earlier, but the COPs are no longer a center of geopolitical activity or gravity like they were just 5 years ago. Countries aren't even submitting their plans to decarbonize in line with the terms of the agreement. The rich world isn't mobilizing for a World War II against climate change. It's mobilizing in the old-fashioned way, with military spending. In the US, Joe Biden seemed to focus his entire presidency on achieving a landmark piece of climate legislation. And he managed, just barely. But 3 years later, the IRA has been stripped down almost to the bone. And there isn't even really widespread anger about it. This story is not just about America. Globally, we got hit by the pandemic and inflation, a new age of warfare, an energy crisis, a new trade war. But the number of climate laws passed by governments around the world has fallen from about 300 just a few years ago to under 50 last year. We hear less about net zero than about energy sovereignty and climate realism. And it's hard not to avoid the conclusion that we're choosing to define as navigable levels of warming which 5 or 8 years ago we chose to define as unacceptable. Politically, the world has kind of just moved on. But that doesn't mean it's all over. It doesn't mean that an environmental apocalypse is right around the corner, or even that our climate future will be defined primarily by normalization of what once looked like totally inconceivable climate disasters. Because as climate has lost its grip on our politics and our geopolitics, decarbonization and green energy has raced ahead, according to a new logic, not of climate politics, but of climate economy and cheap energy abundance. Last year, 93% of new energy added worldwide was clean, meaning that for every unit of dirty capacity brought online, there were more than 10 units of the good, clean stuff. It's not enough yet to push emissions downward, but when we're talking about a competition between fossil fuels and clean energy, it is an absolutely obliterating margin. Investment in green energy has doubled over the last 5 years, and as soon as next year, it's assumed renewables will be the world's largest source of electricity. We talk a lot about solar when we tell the story. It's not the full story, and there's a lot more to do after rolling out renewables and electrifying everything. There's a lot of problems we haven't yet begun to tackle in earnest. But the first task is to implement the technology we have today at the scale we need it. And on that front, with solar in particular, we are really racing ahead at an almost unfathomable speed. But what do I mean by we? An awful lot of that story has been powered by China, which is now responsible for 74% of all solar and wind projects globally and owns an even larger share of the world's green energy supply chains. China built more solar capacity in the first 6 months of this year than the US has ever built in total, cumulatively, over 75 years. And that solar power is now so cheap, it's fueling green energy booms across the global south. In many markets, it's now cheaper to buy a solar panel than it is to buy wood for your yard fence. The most conspicuous example of what that has led to is in Pakistan, a story which is so encouraging, it's quickly becoming a kind of climate optimist lore. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it threw the world's energy markets into crisis. In Pakistan, as elsewhere in South Asia, the result was rolling blackouts and widespread political discontent. And then something kind of miraculous happened. Without any coordination or planning, millions of frustrated Pakistanis began buying and importing rooftop solar panels manufactured in China. The result, once a green energy afterthought, Pakistan is now the 6th largest solar market in the world, with recent solar additions so large that they've effectively doubled the electricity capacity of the country. None of that was planned or centrally funded. In fact, the boom didn't even show up in official government reports, but had to be sleuthed out via satellite imagery. Probably the next countries to follow that path won't do so quite as haphazardly. They'll need some government support. There will be some central planning. But there are now several dozen developing countries, and perhaps more than 50, poised to embark on exactly the same path that Pakistan did, a rapid expansion of their green electricity, which will allow them along the way not just to address their own energy poverty, but declare a kind of independence from the petrostates on which they used to depend. It will also allow them, I think, possibly, to declare a kind of independence from the countries of the global north, whose quasi-philanthropic support was long thought necessary for anything like this kind of green transition in the global south. We'll see how this all unfolds. But the example of Pakistan suggests something much more autonomous and centered in particular poor countries may be a clearer path than waiting around for support from a country like the United States. 10 years ago, when Paris was signed, climate skeptics like to ask, what about China? Would it matter if the rich world decarbonized rapidly, but over there they kept burning coal? Where would that leave the climate project? They're still burning coal in China, and they're still producing carbon by the gigaton, more than twice as much as any other country in the world. And the political future for their green industrial revolution is uncertain, not eternally assured. The CCP is not entirely a philanthropic actor here either. But 10 years after Paris, it seems less important to ask, what about China? Than to ask, where would we be if not for them? And maybe most important to ask what it means and where it takes us for the rich world to give up on climate politics, tossing aside notions of global solidarity and mutual obligation along the way, and trusting the future of the planet to some combination of market forces and Chinese state planning. I don't know what that future looks like. I don't think any of us do. But we are, I worry, about to find out. Thank you.